Okay, I think we'll make a start of it because it is a few minutes past the start, and we do tend to have a lot of people kind of filter in throughout these things. So, everybody, welcome to the latest and newest extractives-led local economic diversification community of practice webinar. For the background, the ELLED program is with the World Bank, Extractives Practice, as well as us at the Mining Shared Value Initiative of Engineers Without Borders. And our entire focus is on pushing and helping the world get local content and economic diversification right around mining and oil and gas. We tend to have a webinar sort of every 2 to 3 months to kind of bring together practitioners on the latest and greatest topics in this space. And increasingly, we've been looking at the green transition and what that means for the mining and oil and gas sectors, and in particular, what it means for local content and economic diversification. So we're quite excited today to be diving into this topic kind of properly for the first time, because we have been looking at this intersection between local procurement and local hiring and all these sort of new local content elements, and what it means when you try to reduce emissions in the mining sector, and what that will implicate for those suppliers, for those host and country employees, and that kind of thing. So, logically, when you think of something like local procurement, you would automatically think that that should help if people are trying to reduce emissions, because that would mean that people would want to have local production of goods and services near the mine because it would reduce delivery times. But what we've learned in the last couple of years is that it's a lot more complicated than that. Obviously, some suppliers in host countries are drawing from relatively dirty grid power, for example, and it may be actually ironically better emissions wise to import from abroad. And likewise, the other angle that we've been discussing is how much it is difficult for the suppliers to work on their own emissions tracking and reduction in order to meet the needs of the mining sector. So we have a great discussion here today. We've got Veronica Martinez from the International Council on Mining and Metals, who have been doing some really exciting work as an industry group on this topic and sort of charting out next steps after making a commitment to look at Scope 3 emissions. Duncan Pettit from Barrick, who we came across recently as one of the companies really probably leading on their efforts to work with suppliers on this topic. And then Benjamin Chiadria from the Southern Mineral Cluster of Peru, along with Daniel Escalante, who's with them today, who, in addition to doing their cluster program to help suppliers, also took part in a really innovative study and tool with the Inter-American Development Bank last year about sort of calculating tools. So if you could just go ahead a slide there, Tatiana. So I just want to frame the discussion really quickly before we dive into the practitioners. First, just some housekeeping. All participants are muted for the duration of the presentation. We do encourage people, if they want to speak to ask a question at the end, but people by all means are completely fine to, in the chat, leave questions, and we always see them and we kind of queue them up at the end of the presentation. So by all means, the presentations will take place. So if you have questions during the presentation, put them in the chat, and we'll make sure that when we get to the Q&A, we won't miss them. So that's the best way forward on that. And then we'll have a lively discussion. So again, just to frame things, I think, a lot of focus has been on Scope 1 and 2 emissions in the mining sector, and Scope 3 emissions, which includes purchased goods and services, is obviously where the issue of local content comes in and how that interacts. And, in our discussions with many mining companies and many practitioners, there was maybe an initial assumption that out of the Scope 3 emissions associated with mining, you have forward linkages into processing and refining and backward linkages into supplying of goods and services. There was a lot of kind of assumptions that maybe the forward linkages would be much more important because, of course, refining and processing of minerals is incredibly energy intensive and that kind of thing. But actually, some of the data that's coming out is showing just how important procurement of goods and services leads to emissions in terms of Scope 3 emissions. So that's why we're kind of here today to discuss the importance of this issue, and also to discuss some of the implications for both local content as an economic diversification goal, as well as implications for suppliers themselves. Next slide, please. Just as I meant, this is just the the three types of emissions. And like I say, the purchase goods and services being part of scope 3. And next slide. And just as an example, we are starting to see, a slow but gradually growing and getting louder recognition of this. And so, in addition to Barrick, who is doing a great job on this topic already, we've seen a number of statements come out from individual mining companies talking about their recognition that this is really important. And like I say, like I alluded to, the ICMM last year made a commitment to start looking at scope 3 emissions. So that's just sort of the framing, is that the mining sector is recognizing how important this topic is, and for that matter, investors and ESG ratings agencies are asking as well. And so that's why we decided to have a discussion today. So with that said, and the introductory remarks done, I will pass it over to Veronica Martinez at the International Council on Mining and Metals.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for the invitation to speak here. So as you said, I'll try to provide kind of an overview on our work as ICMM, and specifically the work that we are doing as an industry body on scope 3 emissions. So next slide, please. I'm gonna a couple of slides on ICMM, because probably maybe not all of you are aware what ICMM is. So the International Council on Mining and Metals, ICMM, we bring together about a third of the global metals and mining industry. You see the logos of our member companies here on the screen. We have 26 mining companies, and we bring them together to drive leadership, action, and innovation. Our member companies, they set the standard for responsibly produced minerals and metals in a safe, just, and sustainable world. And in addition to these 26 mining companies, we have over 35 national and commodity associations that we work with extensively to expand, the outreach of our messaging, of our actions, etc. And we strongly believe that by working together, we hope to achieve a positive impact on our wider industry that can enhance the contribution of mining and metals to the sustainable development. And we really are, especially in this new strategy cycle that we're starting, we're really trying to lead through collaboration. So the next slide. As I just mentioned, we have we're starting this year a new strategy. So we work in a 3-year strategy cycle, and this is a very high-level summary of what our new strategy is, right? As I said, our vision is a safe, just, and sustainable world enabled by responsibly produced mineral metals. And our purpose, as I said before, is lead through collaboration to enhance the contribution of mining and metals to sustainable development. We have 3 strategic pillars. You can see there on screen. The first one is strengthening sustainability, performance, and the contribution of the sector. The second one is enhancing policy and stakeholder engagement. And the third is supporting disclosure and transparency. So the scope 3 topic covers all these 3 pillars. And underneath these 3 pillars, we have 12 projects grouped in these 4 portfolios, as you can see. And climate change is under the environmental resilience, but you can see that we have a broad group of projects that cover most topics related to ESG. Next slide, please. So next one. I'm gonna just take it as an introduction, and Jeff, no, before, thank you. Okay. It's about the net zero commitment all of our member companies did last year. And really this net zero commitment in this updated position statement on climate change is really driving our work for the next 3 years as a strategy, really. So the net zero commitment made by our member companies is that all of them individually committed to achieve net zero on scope 1 and 2 emissions by 2050 or sooner. So again, net zero is about scope 1 and 2 emissions. But if you can see here on the slide, we are, and I'm not going to get into details of all the whole, what it's here on this slide, but it's really about creating and building credible and strong pathways to get to net zero. So that means setting, intermediate targets on scope 1 and 2. So what companies are going to be doing by 2030, 2025. That will depend on, each company's strategy, to really disclose openly and transparent, to really set targets covering all material sources, which is something very relevant for scope 3 emissions, applying robust methodologies to align to the Paris Agreement, etc. But on scope 3 emissions, and you can see that little box on the right bottom of this slide is really what we have committed as ICMM and all of our member companies on accelerating action on scope 3 emissions. And first action means first, all member companies have committed to start reporting scope 3 emissions by next year. By now, almost all of our member companies, they do report scope 3 emissions, but I'm going to explain later what we're doing to really drive a consistent and aligned reporting of scope 3 emissions and why this is so important. And also after that, all member companies have committed also to set targets around scope 3 emissions, if not by the end of next year, as soon as possible. This is all with the purpose of accelerating, and driving emission reduction at scale. And on scope 3 emissions, really, this cannot be done without the collaboration across the value chain. So that's why it's really important, that purpose that we have as ICMM to lead through collaboration. So the next slide, please. Hi. Thanks. So this is just a summary before I go like a little bit on a deep dive on scope 3, but what member companies and more broadly the industry is doing around, scope 1 and 2, of course, renewable energy procurement, it's quite important. South America in general as a region is a region that is very, very well positioned to accelerate the uptake of renewable electricity. In Chile, at least, my home country, about, by 2025, around 90% of mines will have renewable energy procurement. But of course, this is not the same in other jurisdictions where it's more complicated to access renewable electricity, either it's through power purchase agreements or on-site projects. We're also promoting, innovations around, the haul trucks, these big mining trucks, 300-ton trucks. They consume around 3,000, 4,000 liters of diesel per day. So these are really, it's a really big area of focus when it comes to reducing emissions, especially scope 1 emissions. So we have, again, a collaborative initiative with the OEMs, so the truck manufacturers, to really accelerate the development and the uptake of zero emission haul trucks. And then across the value chain, this is, if we go on the right, really, this is what we as ICMM are doing. I'm going to explain this work a little bit later. It's about really accounting and reporting scope 3 emissions, because it's really hard to set meaningful and credible targets on something that you are not measuring correctly or comprehensively. So that's why the focus for these years as ICMM has been on really creating that consistent and aligned accounting and reporting around scope 3 emissions across all of our members. But individual members are also starting to engage with downstream stakeholders, especially in the area of iron ore, met coal, with steel making companies, to support the development of technologies that are capable to reduce emissions. We know that steel represents about 9-10% of global emissions, and iron ore and met coal are key elements of this. So scope 3 emissions for producers of these two commodities are really large. But of course, technology to make zero emission steels, it's still, I'm not going to say in early stages. There's quite a few pilots, and pathways are are more clear, but of course we need acceleration on that technology development and implementation. And something that is again very common and common across all commodities is about downstream emissions and also upstream emission related to transportation, maritime transportation of products to customers. And all of these, of course, because mining is at the heart of the energy transition. The energy transition and the low carbon transition will need critical minerals as copper, nickel, steel, as I was saying, so it means iron ore, that are critical, right, to enable a low carbon world. And again, supporting the principles of a circular economy. So I'm going to explain a little bit, taking a little bit of a deep dive on the counting part and why it's so important. What we started to do is, if we go into the next slide, please. So when we started to work on scope 3 emissions, and because of our membership is so diverse in terms of the commodities they produce, we started to analyze, okay, what are the challenges that companies are facing when reporting scope 3 emissions, and that means then, of course, after, and it means taking action on scope 3 emissions. And we identified these two main groups around our members, right? Precious metals, gold, silver, PMGs, and also copper when you have integrated operations. So when smelting and refining happens within the boundaries of a company, then for those type of companies, and as Jeff was saying, upstream emissions, and scope 3 emissions represent the largest share. So over 40% of a company's scope 3 emissions can come from upstream emissions if you belong into this group. And again, as Jeff was mentioning, the first category, the purchased goods and services, often represent the most part of these emission within upstream categories. And the main challenges, of course, that this group of companies are represented, probably Duncan will share much more on this, is the engagement with suppliers in terms of having access to data, standardized gathering data in terms of the process, but also the quality of the information you're getting, and also establishing kind of supplier specific methods that can help you to improve the quality of the data that you're getting. And also that will help you to enhance, again, the engagement you have with your suppliers, thinking, on future targets. Then we have another group of mining companies, and within our membership, that the focus is mainly in downstream. I was mentioning, main commodities as iron ore, met coal, nickel, copper. Copper when, for example, the not integrated operations, so companies that develop or produce copper concentrate, and then they ship that into smelting and refineries. So in their case, the main a portion of the scope 3 emission comes from categories of the processing of salt products and the use of salt products, and that can account at least 90% of this the total scope 3 emissions. In the case, for example, of iron ore, 95% of scope 3 emissions come from the category of processing of salt products because it's closely linked to the production of steel. And the main challenges, again, the steel challenge, and especially for when we think about the measuring, the reporting, there are quite a few companies that they produce both iron ore and met coal, and both go into the steel making process. So they have challenges to avoid double counting of emissions. And then, of course, defining those boundaries and processes. I think that's a common challenge for all companies, really understanding the boundaries of your scope 3 emissions, etc. Then, that picture that Jeff showed in the beginning, those 15 categories on scope 3 emissions, I would say, and of course, it doesn't mean that these categories shouldn't be reported, but probably they are not material for mining and metal companies are the ones you see there, business travel, employee commuting, etc. So the focus of our work is to really drive a comprehensive, so we think that all categories should be reported, but then of course the action should be prioritized on those material categories. So the next slide, and that will be my last slide, is really what we're doing. So the aim, again, is to create a framework for an aligned and consistent approach to account and report scope 3 emissions, because this will give a better overview to companies to where and with whom they need to engage across the supply chain to drive meaningful emission reductions. So because we are diverse, organization, our members are quite diverse. They operate in different jurisdictions with different opportunities and challenges. The commodities, shape, the emission scope 3 emission profile very clearly. This framework should allow, flexible implementation across all of our member companies. On the right side of this slide, you will see what are the key dimensions that we have identified to really that are driving this framework that we're developing. First of all, having real clarity on how to establish materiality thresholds. So when a category is material, so it means that I need to take action to reduce emissions, and even within a category, for example, on the category 1, when you purchase good, if maybe 5 suppliers, they represent 90% of my emissions on that, well, I need to start developing targeted action with each of them. So what are those materiality thresholds? Then setting those operational boundaries very, very clearly. And I think then the data challenge, the data quality. So how good is the data you're using to account scope 3 emissions, whether are industry average, supplier specific information, etc., and the data management, how you're managing the data within your company, within the boundaries of your company, and also with your suppliers and customers. What key activities we're doing? We have done a benchmark on understanding best practices in other hard to abate sectors like cement, chemical, oil and gas. Also understanding what are the current practices within our members to measure and report scope 3 emissions. So that we have seen a few differences, for example, to approach the challenge of double counting, etc. And then getting really into developing some guidance on each of these 4 dimensions to the materiality thresholds criteria, really understanding the bottlenecks. So we're doing now in the next few months, we're doing a self-assessment process with ICMM members to really understand where are the gaps, but really getting into the details. So what is, upstream? What are really the gaps that are preventing you to have a really robust, measurement of scope 3 emissions? And then understanding what are the existing tools. So there are plenty of tools to account scope 3 emissions. But how we can, improve them, whether it's having access to standardized, for example, set of emission factors that everyone can use. So then scope 3 emissions can become a little bit more comparable between companies, and then the action that each company is taking on scope 3 emissions is also not necessarily comparable, but it's meaningful because it's been set under a very robust set of baseline. So that's the work we're doing. As you see, it's very broad. Hopefully will set the foundations of scope 3 emissions measuring and reporting in the sector, and then each of the companies, of course, they will have the massive task of developing targets for scope 3 emissions and specific actions on engaging upstream suppliers, as Jeff was mentioning, and of course downstream, especially for the iron ore and met coal producers. So that's my presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. We really appreciate the presentation to lay out the kind of the groundwork you're doing, and I hope that in some way the kind of thing we're trying to do with this the ELLED community of practice is to bring together everybody so that we don't recreate the wheel, and that we can all kind of learn from each other, including people like the next speaker, which is Duncan Pettit from Barrick. And Barrick is a company, one of those precious metals producers that Veronica alluded to, who is working on this in a big way. And again, we hope that the lessons and early findings of their work can be used by other companies and practitioners attending today and beyond this. So over to you, Duncan.
Thanks, Jeff, and good day to everyone. As introduced, I'm Duncan Pettit, Sustainability Manager at Barrick. And for us, sustainability includes everything from health and safety to social and community, and then, of course, environment, which includes our climate risk and resilience. So really happy to be sharing the work that we've undertaken to date, and of course our roadmap for our scope 3 emissions and our value chain. Just moving on to the next slide, just to briefly draw your attention to our cautionary statement, but we'll jump right into the next one. And to start, I just wanted to touch on our sustainability strategy, which really focuses on what we call holistic and integrated sustainability management. And what that means is sustainability aspects and impacts don't occur in silos, but rather they overlap and interlink, and they must be tackled in conjunction with and in reference to each other. So far too often we do see sustainability aspects are siloed by some stakeholders, and the interactions and consequences of one action aren't considered on other sustainability aspects. And this is where we at Barrick, we place a lot of emphasis on assessing, understanding, managing, and then trying to communicate these interactions and interconnections. And doing so successfully really ensures that not only do we have efficiencies that are realized, but value is really maximized and shared. So I just wanted to briefly draw your attention to our infographic on the right. And this really summarizes some of these interconnections that we deal with. And most notably, the nexus between communities and our goal to eradicate poverty, and then the impacts from climate change and building climate resilience. And we won't get into it today, but also the role and impact to nature and biodiversity. So it's really within this context that the value chain comes into focus and the associated Scope 3 emissions. So on to the next slide. And really the mining sector is vital if we are to achieve the UN Sustainability Development Goals, not so much just for its role in providing some of the key minerals for development, but because of also the ability to drive socio-economic development, build that community resilience, and reach some of these rural and isolated communities throughout the globe, which due to their isolated nature often means that these communities are the most vulnerable. And so our supply chain is an incredibly powerful lever for the socio-economic development, and is really critical for achieving both our sustainability strategy, but also developing and maintaining our social license to operate. So wherever we can, we hire and buy local, and this really helps inject and keep money in our local communities and in our host countries. So by sourcing goods and services from these local communities and in country, we really can contribute to their local economic development, but then help facilitate the development of a thriving and self-sustaining businesses, and ensure that these businesses succeed long after the operations have ceased and the mine has closed. And of course, doing this also has a multiplier effect. So keeping money in our local communities and host countries means that not only is their socioeconomic status developed, but more businesses and services are required to service those vendors, more jobs are created and provided. And of course, this also means increased tax for local governments as well. And this all has a real positive snowball effect in the communities. So how does our procurement work? And really, this is where goods and skills are available. We will prioritize that at the local level or for local suppliers. If those products or the quality that we require isn't immediately available at the local level, we then look one level above, so in the province or region. We then look at further afield at a national or host country level, and only beyond that do we start looking internationally. But we also take a longer term view, and our site supply teams really are empowered to help identify local companies and businesses, and then work with them to build capacity and improve their standards at these local companies. And that's either through mentorship programs, skills and business training opportunities, and even in some cases, providing loans to cover the cost of CapEx materials or equipment, or even starting up some of these businesses. So just some key metrics for the past year in 2021. But we procured goods and services worth just short of $1.7 billion from suppliers closest to our operations, so those are our local communities. And then in total spent nearly $5.5 billion on goods and services within our host countries. So this really does equate to more than 80% of our total procurement in a year is kept within the country of operations. Moving on to the next slide there, and this brings us to our climate change strategy and our Scope 3 emissions. And we've really spent a lot of time, effort, and resources in the past 18 months calculating, but also understanding our Scope 3 emissions. So firstly, our Scope 3 emissions, which are our value chain, they account for about 40% of our total emissions. So that's when considering Scope 1, which is our direct, Scope 2, indirect electricity, and Scope 3. So it is a large portion of our total emissions. And then within these 40% of Scope 3 emissions, we found that more than 99% of our emissions really fall within the upstream value chain. And of that 99%, really within 4 categories of our Scope 3 categories. So these are within the categories of goods and services, fuels and energy, and then capital goods, and lastly, upstream transport, so getting the goods to site. But then we've also incorporated some other categories that we've maintained as material to our business, despite them having a negligible contribution to the emissions in terms of value. And these are employee commuting, processing and refining, and then business travel, as we have the categories summarized at the bottom of the slide there. So when we're looking at and expanding our emissions to all of these categories, including what are negligible but still material, you'll see our downstream emissions really only count for about 0.5% of our Scope 3 emissions. So getting to this level of understanding and granularity amongst the different Scope 3 categories really allowed us to then assess where we should place our focus and prioritize in seeking value chain emission reduction opportunities. So just to talk through some of those, fuel and transmission losses, they account for just over 1 million tons of CO2 emissions. And this category really faces a similar roadmap and challenges as our own Scope 1 and 2 emissions. And that's in our Scope 1 and 2 reduction projects will directly influence the emissions within this category. So very simply, for example, if we replace HFO power generation on site with solar, we'll naturally use less HFO on site. That will reduce our Scope 1 emissions, but also the Scope 3 emissions for the fuel use within Category 3. Similarly, if we change our purchase electricity to a renewable energy provider, that will reduce our Scope 2 emissions. And then similarly, the transmission losses in energy required for a green source will have a much lower energy or emission factor than from a non-renewable energy source. So really our current GHG reduction roadmap already takes care of Category 3 Scope 3 emissions. So we sort of place that on the side. Then on capital goods, which also accounts for just over 1 million tons of CO2 from our emission profile. Our capital goods are not a consistent emission profile year on year. So we do see discrepancies year on year, depending on what capital projects we are implementing. So these are very often one-off large purchases that our local suppliers don't necessarily have the goods or skills to do because they are not a consistent product. And also it allows us to really shop around for goods that are sourced from lower emission profiles. So again, because of its inconsistent year-on-year profile, we sort of set that aside and it has its own roadmap in sourcing these goods. So it really leaves us with our goods and services, which is our most material category, not only one because it's the largest category within our Scope 3 emissions, so accounting for nearly 50% of our Scope 3 emissions, but also because this is where we've spent our most time to date building our relationships and our partnerships and our effort in localizing those supply chains, where we share the value of purchases made in country and to our local suppliers. Of course, localizing our supply chains also means that we reduce the upstream transportation requirements, which is the fourth category of Scope 3 emissions there. And once we reduce that emission or that distance between our suppliers and the mine, we naturally reduce those emissions. Conversely, some of the challenges that we face with goods and services, and particularly to our local suppliers, is that their own energy needs are really limited in their availability, whether they have access to the grid or in their own ability to influence or find alternative energy sources for their own emissions. But we've always been very vocal in our group climate change strategy that climate change really requires global collective action, but not at the expense of our vulnerable communities or host countries. And this is really important to note because we have come under pressure from some stakeholders that we need to prioritize emission reductions above all else. And this is why I reiterated earlier that our strategy really needs to look at sustainability in an integrated and holistic manner. So we can't prioritize scope 3 reductions over, for example, local supply chains, because if this were to happen, again, we run the risk of excluding the most vulnerable communities from the economy, and doing so leave them to further vulnerable action, more vulnerable to poverty, and again, to the effects of climate change. So it's with this in mind that we've developed our Scope 3 roadmap, which really outlines how we intend to build capacity within our supply chain to not only understand their current emission understanding and awareness, their reporting maturity, and their reduction opportunities, but then to also help them build capacity and capability to enact on all of those requirements. And I think this is something we've done before within our supply chain. It's not something new, whether it's been code of conducts and ethics, or modern slavery and human rights concerns, or simply health and safety standards. We've been down this path with suppliers many times before, and we've helped them build and develop that capacity to ensure that these local suppliers are upskilled, they are empowered, and then they can contribute to the economy and access these opportunities that are made available. So this is really where we currently are in our Scope 3 journey. We've started these engagements with prioritized suppliers, both at the local level, but also further afield. And we're currently working with them to understand their awareness, and then working with these partners to not only get robust emission calculations, but then also to set meaningful reduction targets that we know are defensible and achievable. And I think once we manage to get over that hurdle, we'll certainly be in a position to not only help those suppliers set and achieve those reduction targets, but it's something they can benefit from. And again, something that we can, as a company at Barrick, can benefit from in working that journey together. So thanks very much for letting us share our journey. I do encourage, if you haven't, to read our sustainability report. It not only includes this, but our Scope 1 and 2 emission reduction roadmap as well. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Duncan. That's really inspiring stuff in terms of this balance between reducing emissions, but not displacing local suppliers. And obviously, we all know the social license to operate implications of that. So it's also in the business interest of extracting industries to do that. So really excited to hear your initial progress on that, and hopefully that helps other companies learn some lessons. So with that in mind, I'm going to pass it over to Benjamin from SEMI, who, again, as I discussed, was part of a really innovative study and tool creation around this carbon emissions calculations around procurement. So I will pass it over to SEMI. And just really quickly before I do that, again, just as a reminder, you can continue to put questions in the chat. And like I say, everyone will make sure that all the questions are addressed in the Q&A at the end of this presentation. So over to you, Benjamin.
Thank you, Jeff and Tatiana, for the opportunity. Well, I'm going to present a brief summary of this project that SAMI had the opportunity to collaborate last year for greener procurement in the mining industry for the Andean region. But first of all, let me take a couple of minutes to present SAMI. Next slide, please. Well, SAMI, Cluster Minero Andino, is an initiative that was launched in 2019 by CAF, the Latin American Development Bank, and the Chamber of Commerce of Arequipa. We also have four mining founder partners, Hadbay, Cerro Verde of Freeport McMoRan, Anglo-American Quellaveco, and Southern Copper of Grupo México. Next, please. We have been developing a large network of collaboration with companies and institutions. Among that, we have mining companies, mining and suppliers associations. We have foreign trade departments of countries like Canada, Australia, Israel, Chile, Chamber of Commerce, and government institutions. Next, please. Our purpose is to promote a robust mining and supplier ecosystem, making the benefits of the sector more visible and tangible to the population, and that the mining industry became a driver of development and prosperity for Peru. How we propose to do that through more collaboration and associativity in the ecosystem, developing a technology-based mining supply sector with exports capacity, and through green mining, driving the decarbonization of mining based on hydrogen and the management of Scope 3 emissions. Next, please. Our strategy is based on five pillars: our governance, innovation, competitiveness, supplier acceleration, and sustainability. Well, one of our main programs is our Open Innovation Program that we have been working with our four mining partners. We also have a networking program for suppliers to connect with their peers in other countries. We are working now in the design of the first center of excellence for mining and suppliers in Peru, and we are just finishing the first binational roadmap for Peru and Chile to implement hydrogen in mining. This in partnership with Corporación Alta Ley de Chile. These are some of the activity we are working currently. Next, please. So that's about SAMI. Now I'm going to present a summary of this project of IDB for a greener procurement in the mining industry. Next slide. The main objectives of this project were to identify and categorize key suppliers considering potential to reduce Scope 3 emissions, to identify opportunities for nearshoring, also to identify a platform to broker mining challenges from industry and local solution provider, and to document conditions and factors likely to facilitate emissions reduction through greener industry procurement practices. Those were the objectives. The scope was larger copper mines in Peru, Chile, and Colombia. Next, please. Well, this Jeff already explained the difference within the scope. This project was focused in Scope 3 emissions, including upstream activities and downstream activities. This is a quote that I think is interesting to share, that mining accounts 4% of the global emissions, but emissions from its supply chains can be more than 20 times higher. This is why it's very important to address Scope 3 emissions. Next, please. And this is a very interesting slide about our methodology and how we measure the Scope 3 emissions depending of the type of mine and the processes, because every process in a mine had a different category of supplies that had the particular emissions. So if you have an open pit mine, you have a specific category of supplies like tires, production of fuels and lubricants, transport of supplies to work like diesel, explosives, and tires. If you have an underground mine, you have other categories of supplies like tires, fortification structures, and others. Also, if you have a mine that produces copper oxide, you have a specific process like crushing, leaching, solvent extraction, electrowinning, and each of these processes have each categories of supplies specific. And also, if you produce copper sulfides, you have other processes like grinding, flotation, smelting, and each process has specific categories of supplies. That, in general, that's the way we measure the Scope 3 in this project. Next slide, please. Sorry. About the primary sources of information, we have the main copper mines in Chile, Peru, and Colombia. In Chile, we have Codelco with all their operations, BHP, Antofagasta Minerals, Anglo American, Glencore, Freeport-McMoRan. In the case of Peru, Freeport-McMoRan, Salvador Copper, MMG, Glencore, Hudbay, Goldfields, Chinalco, Anglo American, and in the case of Colombia, Anglo Gold Ashanti with this project, Quebradona. Next slide, please. About the main findings, we've been able to decompose the total emissions for the copper mining industry in Chile. And as you can see, 51% of the emissions are of Scope 3, 30% of the emissions Scope 2, and 19% Scope 1. This is the decomposed of the total emissions for the Chilean mining industry, the copper mining industry. Unfortunately, in Peru, we couldn't be able to deconstruct the total emissions because we don't have official figures for Scope 1 and 2, but we could have the figures for the Scope 3. Next slide, please. So we can see the decomposition of the Scope 3 for Chile and Peru. We have a very similar decomposition. The emissions, of course, are different between Chile and Peru, but in terms of the share, the mining operations in the case of Chile is 59%. The sea freight is 6%, and smelter and refinery 35%. Very similar in Peru, mining operations is 58% of the emissions, sea freight 7%, and smelter and refinery 35%. But we're going to analyze the mine operation emissions, and here we have some difference between Peru and Chile. Next slide, please. Here we can see the decomposition of the mining operation emissions in the case of Chile. And as we can see, we have a concentration of some supplies that represent the majority of the emissions. Next slide. Here we can see that the grinding balls represent 24% of the emissions. And then we have the explosive with 18%. Then the fuel, the sulfuric acid, and lime. Next. And these five supplies represent 80% of the emissions in the case of the mining operation in Chile. Next. In the case of Peru, we have a slight difference. We also have here that grinding balls and explosive represent also 50% of the emissions. Next. And the main supplies or categories are grinding balls, lime, fuel, explosives, and concentrated ground transportations. Next. And here we can see that these five supplies or categories represent almost 90% of the emissions in the case of Peru. These are the main findings of this project. This is my last slide, but also I want to share some of the general recommendations we had in this project. First of all, that the governments in the region must take a proactive role in advancing joint GHG reduction agreements with other countries that are also part of the copper supply chain. We think that these agreements should include key elements such as information exchange and access to the net zero investments and technology. Also, as we can just saw, Scope 3 emissions in mining operations are very concentrated in 4 or 5 supplies that represent approximately 80% of the total emissions. So the main effort should be concentrated in manage these supplies. There are opportunities for nearshoring, for sure. For example, for grinding balls. Here, governments should consider the applicability of carbon taxes, looking for a break-even point where local grinding balls are competitive. And finally, given the gaps that we have been identified in the monitoring and reduction of GHG emissions, we recommend the implementation of an observatory, whose objective should be to support the measurement, homologation, reporting, analysis, and the validation of GHG emissions of the copper mining industry in the Andean region. So this is all I can share with you, and thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Ben. I mean, that was a really amazing level of detail, particularly on the individual products, which again is one of our assumptions is that it's not about measuring every single ballpoint pen that the mining industry buys, but what are the projects and opportunities to make the biggest difference? And I think you laid out a pretty big one there with the grinding media. So really exciting stuff. So we've got about 30 minutes. As I mentioned before, people can put their chat or the questions in the chat and address them to 1, 2, or all 3 speakers. Really, we have a pretty high caliber lineup here in terms of practitioners who are deep in this topic. So I encourage those to post a question. I might, so as the moderator, I'll take the prerogative to ask my own question, and it links a bit to your point about the grinding media. I mean, maybe, I might throw it to you, Duncan, and maybe Veronica, in terms of, what are you, in your experience so far, what do you see as some big opportunities? Are there certain products that right now you think happen to be all imported from somewhere, perhaps China, that using coal power, and you see an opportunity to make local, or are there any sort of initial ideas about quick wins when it comes to products?
Yeah, I think firstly, obviously, whatever the supply or good is, we are trying to localize that in any case. So it's not so much always driven by what is the highest emitter and moving away from that, more how can we localize our supply chains as part of that partnership model we do, and emissions profile and reductions just happen to be a supplementary consequent or addition that we look into that. So within our prioritization, we're still working through that journey, because this is a journey, but within that, looking at our local supply chains and what products do we see the low-hanging fruit, and certainly we'll be putting more emphasis and focus there. But it is very much a site-by-site basis, and again, what energy or electricity grids are available to those countries and those suppliers. So that does have a big role to play. But again, it's also understanding their awareness enables us to make some of those decisions, their emissions awareness. So it is a journey and a progress, but very much site by site based. So we will be getting a bit deeper into some of those low hanging fruits and focusing there at the site level.
Great. Veronica,
just to add, as Duncan was saying, because it is very side by side, we don't, as ICMM, we haven't been really discussing on focusing on specific products, but I think what we're doing will allow companies to maybe get to the level of detail that either Benjamino or Duncan were explaining on narrowing there. And if we see maybe there are some common areas for all members, probably we could start developing some collaboration opportunities, just as similar as we did for Scope 1 and the truck manufacturers. If there's something, a key group of stakeholders that is relevant for all member companies in terms of their Scope 3 emissions, and that it makes sense to engage through ICMM as a collaboration, we're happy to explore that opportunity, especially when they are stakeholders that we can have influence on, and then we can start collaborating.
Great, thanks so much. We have a hand. Savannah Tordo has her hand up. I don't know, Meg or Gloria, if you can allow Savannah to ask her question verbally. Maybe she's typed it, or no? Hoping Meg or Gloria, can you unmute Savannah? Sorry, friends. Maybe while we get that sorted out, I'm going to go to another question in the chat, which is Casey Ferreter asked to Benjamin, super interesting, which actors do you hope to receive and use the data that you've put together, or for that matter, with the data that was created by the study? Where do you hope that data goes and how it's used?
Well, actually, I think it's very, very important, especially in the case of Peru and the region, that companies start to share information and strategy to address the Scope 3 emissions. In the case of Peru, this is a conversation that just started, I think, maybe last year and this year. But I think there are no strategies in all the industry. Just a few companies are starting to develop some plans about this. But I think it's very important to share information and start to build some joint strategies I think in the region, in the region that include Peru, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, and other countries of the Andean region.
Fantastic. I should point out that in our own research on this topic, we have noticed that it has been more the investors and mining companies themselves leading on this, and not so much on the government side. So, hopefully this data is a bit of a wake-up call. And as we alluded to, Chile is doing this study with the IDB, in Peru, and to a lesser extent Colombia. But to be honest, beyond that, we haven't seen too much. So hopefully this is a bit of a wake-up call for governments and some of the intergovernmental forums and activities to include this. So I believe we have Silvana now teed up.
Jeff, this is Rana. I'm the ELLED program leader for the bank. Thanks to all of you for the fantastic presentation. I have a couple of follow-up questions for Benjamin and for Duncan, really. For Benjamin, I was quite intrigued by one of your conclusions that you had opted to suggest that an external body would, if you wish, review and confirm, certify, if you wish, Scope 3 emissions. And I was wondering what led to that conclusion. What would be the upside compared to self-certification by the companies once a common standard for reporting is identified as suggested by the ICMM? And for Duncan, I can say the merging of the two concepts of local value creation and sustainability, environmental sustainability, which granted goes a little bit beyond climate impact, is actually the focus of the ELLED program, has been the focus for a long time. And we have been struggling to find a recipe, if you wish, to increase the local content while at the same time decreasing environmental footprint. So I was intrigued by the work that you are doing, and I was wondering whether you are considering by category of spend interventions with local suppliers. For example, if a big part of the footprint is access to lack of access to low carbon energy, what can the mine itself do to provide extra energy access to those suppliers? Or if the issue is perhaps linked to scarce water resources, what could the mine do to provide training or access to water to the affected suppliers? Have you been thinking about it, or even in terms of mines that are in the same area, what can a mine cluster do to alleviate some of the constraints to abating impact on the environment?
We go with Benjamin first.
Yes, thank you. Well, thank you for the question. Of course, we think each company should address and develop their own strategies. So sometimes each company has different realities for the others. But when we talk about an observatory, we think with a kind of a platform that share information between companies and help to develop some ground guidelines of the way to address these Scope 3 emissions. Sometimes some companies think that it's very difficult to follow up the emissions of some, especially local suppliers. But when we see the figures about the concentration of the emission, maybe we can start with managing those supplies of those categories first, and that's information that very useful to be shared between all the companies. So we think companies should address their own strategy, but it should be helpful to have kind of a platform to share some information and best practices.
Yeah, thanks, Silvana. That's a really good question, and it is something we've been talking about internally. Ultimately, our environmental policies, all our other policies, apply to our supply chain as well. So we need to make sure that we have processes in place and checks and balances to make sure, of those suppliers or vendors, are they complying with the policies as we expect them to? And if not, why is that? Is it a capacity issue? Is it a capability or a resourcing issue? And then how can we, help them upskill and empower to those levels? So, as I said earlier, in the past, I think we've all been through this process of ethics, modern slavery, human rights, and particularly health and safety. And that's been a lot of the focus. And without a doubt, emissions and environmental, whether it be water, biodiversity, all of those are coming in where companies are needing to take the lead in not only upskilling them, but then doing the required due diligence where those are falling short within their suppliers. It is a long process, and again, it's a risk-based process of which of those suppliers or vendors are the highest risk, and trying to prioritize and work through in a defensible process and a risk-based process in doing that. In terms of what we can do to do that beyond just a skills-based upskilling, certainly there are some opportunities that we would need to look at in providing that. As I say, we have in the past, whether it be loans to bridge some of those gaps. We can always look at that going forward if that is the case in terms of energy needs or alternative water sources. And then again, as Veronica kind of alluded to earlier, the opportunity for collective action in a certain area. So where we have peers operating in a region that is rural, coming together and collectively enhancing those suppliers' abilities not only helps them, but it also helps us as peers to have suppliers that are able to respond to some of those impacts. And again, supports our larger social license to operate. So lots of work to be done, certainly thinking about it, moving in that journey, but by no certain means a lot more to be done as well.
Great.
Thanks very much. Sorry, just another little thought. It's to both of you, thanks very much. In fact, I'm particularly intrigued, Duncan, by exploring ways in which perhaps clusters or corridors that connects different sectors could create enough demand for certain scarce elements like access to clean energy, for example, to actually help local value chains to decarbonize if you're looking at carbon, for example. But you could do the same with water resources if you're looking at biodiversity and access to water. And I was wondering whether the ICMM is actually looking into this possibility. I mean, the bank is. So I was wondering if you guys were also thinking about it.
Yeah, so I think I'm not sure if I really understood correctly the question, but we as ICMM, what we want to drive here is really the, not getting into the specifics of, the scope 3 and really, because our endpoint really is to drive, emission reduction at scale. And if we could do that through collaboration, that's, that's our ultimate purpose. So before that, I wanted just to mention on the point that Benjamin was saying on having, industry level sources that everyone can use, whether it's best practices or information. We are thinking, and that will come through the self-assessment that we're doing with members, really understanding what can be built. So for example, do we need a database of emission factors that everyone can use, more like the same emission factors, whether it's upstream or downstream, and things like that we can help eventually. We have also, for example, have identified in specific categories what type of information would you need to access, whether the materiality of that. So if it's not a material category, that's fine. You can use industry average or things like that. But then if it's a material category, really, having, and we see Scope 3 as a journey. There's no kind of right way to do it at first. As Duncan was saying, this is a process, so it's basically understanding where are those hotspots in your value chain and trying to engage with, you need to first to have the most robust data that you can, and then of course moving into the action. Of course there will be things that can be shared as an industry, and others are of course more sensitive, and they become a little bit competitive, especially downstream, but upstream. So that's where we see our scope of action as ICMM, and then of course if there are opportunities of collaboration similar to what we're doing with the OEMs, using that kind of model replicated into across different parts of the value chain. But that's where we see mainly our role as ICMM.
Great. And did you have another thought, Veronica? I know you were about to speak.
No, it was about what we were thinking, but we really want to understand, based on this self-assessment that we're doing with all the 26 member companies, where we as ICMM we can add value as an industry, and what are things that member companies will need or are trying to figure out by themselves. And as Duncan was there, also to see if there are kind of more regional collaboration approaches that could be made, and then we can use our associations or member associations to accelerate that type of collaboration. So for example, whether it's Peru, I was really interested to see the Benjamin's information, and also to think that sometimes when you look at a commodity level, if you want to understand the commodity level of Scope 3 emission, the analysis is a bit different. If you do it at a corporate level, we are working with our member associations to develop a carbon footprint approach for specific products that they consider basically cradle-to-gate approaches as a product. So for example, in the case of copper in Chile, it's up to copper concentrate when then you ship it to the smelters in China. But then our corporate level, of course, that's a little bit more complex because you need to consider those downstream. So it depends again the approach, but we're working coordinated with those commodity associations, looking at the kind of the commonalities and differences between the carbon footprint approach and the Scope 3 emission approach.
Fantastic. I've got a question and maybe a provocative question, but also a compliment teed up from Humphrey Simba from ASNL Advisory, which is a consulting firm in Tanzania who works on local content. Humphrey says, congratulations to Barrick for a local procurement spend at 80%. But then he kind of asked a bit deeper, what is this associated with value addition? So in terms of measuring that 80%, are you able to disaggregate the spending which is on locally manufactured and locally produced goods versus those that are imported, I suppose, which obviously has huge implications for local content as well as social license, but then again, also opportunities for Scope 3 emissions reduction. So I suppose the question is, what kind of disaggregation are you able to do within that 80%?
Yeah, I'm sure we'll be able to. Will I have an answer off the hand now? No, I don't think so. I think without a doubt, there's probably a combination of those two. What I will say is, where we deem it local spend, we are talking about entities or corporations that are, majority owned within that country. So yes, there could be circumstances where it is, value add or locally produced. So within that, it's probably a combination to some extent. But no, I wouldn't know off the hand, but certainly it's majority owned host country businesses that we use as the defining tool there.
Great. And we can say with confidence that's not uncommon. I mean, it's very difficult. We do see a differentiation from mining companies on locally owned and branch operations and international operations, but we haven't seen much in the way of companies being able to break down imported versus non-imported, and that gets even more complicated because is 2 parts put together manufactured that's imported. I mean, it's really easy to game that. I know that, for example, the South African government has really struggled with this because they've been trying to do a classification system for their procurement because they have a 70%, or I should say they did have a 70% locally manufactured target until the court, I guess, rejected the current mining charter. But this is sort of the $1 million question for value addition, but also I think increasingly for carbon emissions reduction. So there was one more question coming in. Sam Shepard asks, what are some challenges anticipated in terms of emissions data collection from suppliers? Any discussion on how to address inconsistencies in calculation approaches and set operational boundaries? Maybe for
Yeah, I can have a go. I mean, without a doubt, that's some of the biggest challenges that we're facing, and that's why we spend so much time, firstly understanding their awareness of emissions calculations and reporting, and then working with them where are some of those gaps or upskilling that's needed. We've also, putting together an awareness piece with our suppliers where really this is some of the, if they aren't using an accepted international set of standards or guidelines to do it, this is what we expect. These are the agreed upon reporting boundaries. And then in some cases, even providing a tool directly for them. So really getting them to complete that tool, which then gives us at least the comfort of the standardization among some of those calculations. Of course, our tool is based on how we would do our own calculations, so with internationally accepted guidelines and standards, but then just trying to avoid those discrepancies among suppliers, and then again, helping on the education piece within that. So I think in a few years' time, we will hopefully get to a place where it's a lot more independently calculated, but until then, we're certainly taking the onus in trying to make sure that those calculations, reporting boundaries are all robust, defensible, and obviously standardized as far as we can. But it is the biggest challenge we have with getting those supplier emissions.
Yeah, and just from the ICMM perspective is what we have identified as the main challenge, and that's why we're trying to develop these kind of set of guidelines to at least at a high level and not a commodity level think about how upstream and downstream, because then with customers also it gets tricky as well. So we have and also just as an example, for example, for iron ore met coal producers, Scope 3 emissions, Duncan said for Barrick is about 40% of your total, emissions profile. For other type of commodities, Scope 3 emissions can be 95% of the total. So then it becomes kind of the place where you need to focus actions, but of course are not necessarily under your control or influence. So that's where, again, it's so that's why we're thinking that through pushing a consistent and line measurement, you can start engaging upstream, downstream on data, but then moving to the target setting bit.
Great. Actually, I have a question. Maybe it's perhaps quite specific, but it strikes me on the opportunities, the number of service providers, and I mean more on the sort of the intellectual, consulting service providers, advice, the amount of people flying, for example, from very far off, and certainly a lot of countries where there isn't an established consultant base for a number of issues, and you'll see consultants being flown over all the way from Canada to Ghana, for example. And I'm wondering so far, and it might be for you, Duncan, in terms of how big a share actually is that in terms of air travel for service providers? Is that actually a meaningful opportunity in the grand scheme of things, or does it just maybe appear so because of the high profile nature of air travel and how many emissions are associated with that?
I mean, look, every step counts, but it is overall pretty negligible. So I think ours was at about 26,000 tons, which, as a company just short of 12 million tons of emissions, it does contribute negligibly. But when you start getting to, conversations of targets and net zeros, every single ton counts. So it is again, an easy, quick win, although perhaps in terms of making material reductions, it's maybe a bit of a slower burner.
Great. I've got a question here from Razil Zisman, who asked, and this is, I think, also for you, Duncan. Does Barrick contemplate assisting enterprises and entities in the area of influence of the mining operations to reduce their global greenhouse gas emissions, i.e. those who are not suppliers are directly linked with the mining operation? So I suppose,
I guess our suppliers. Yeah, look, I think just getting step one, our suppliers, is such a ginormous challenge at the moment, and getting that standardized, that's really where our priority is for now. I guess how the process of influence and scope 3s work, by influencing our suppliers, you hope in turn they start influencing their suppliers, as they need to have, reporting their scope emissions. They need to know what their suppliers are contributing to that, and it sort of works in a chain. So that's the idealistic way of how it works, but at the moment we're just focusing on our immediate suppliers for now.
okay, fair enough. And then linked, and this is maybe more for Veronica or maybe both of you, but are there any examples where the flow sheet of mining has been altered to reduce emissions? For example, new milling technologies or more intense use of explosives, for example?
What we have seen, for example, is some changes or examples that some suppliers are doing. So, for example, the use of green hydrogen to produce green ammonia and then use it in the explosive that are used in the mining sector. So, for example, in Chile, where there's been a strong policies to support the market, to create a market for green hydrogen, we see that, and of course, local mining companies are supporting those efforts, but again, that's kind of bringing new products into the market. So I think that there is space for all that. And for example, if you on the new milling technologies, we are, beside scope 3 emissions, for example, working on tailings reduction. So how you can basically alter or modify or improve the mining process to reduce tailings reduction. And then you have a lot of changes within, for example, in the grinding part, because you're becoming more precise in the ways you mine, and then it's so again, as Duncan was saying, everything is quite interconnected. These topics are not silos. So if you make a change, for example, the process with the objective of reducing tailings, that will impact on the emissions you're using, whether it's 1, 2, and 3, the use of water, and other impacts. But for example, it's interesting. We're really looking, with interest, that example of the green ammonia, because again, then you can start thinking about, some or maybe aggregated supply for green hydrogen that you can use for either green explosives or hydrogen within mining processes, etc.
Great. Okay, well, we're just coming up to the end of the webinar. I really appreciate all the questions have been really great. Again, it's a very practitioner-heavy crowd, both on the panel, and we can put some of the people in the attendance in the panel as well, because there's a lot of people working on this as well. So we thank all those people for attending. It's also June 30th, so we appreciate people kind of staying online. Maybe it's a very sunny, nice day wherever you are. In terms of next steps, what we always do with these webinars is they are recorded, so they eventually do go up online on a channel. We post a summary of the webinar on the ELLED community of practice. Again, for those who are not already who are attending, who are not members of the ELLED community of practice, you can email myself or Tatiana Alarcon, who are both the officers for the community practice. And then likewise, we encourage everybody to log into the community practice, post stories about this topic. For example, we do have a monthly newsletter which essentially summarizes the world of local content, and now increasingly the local content and the green transition. So if you have content to post, it will be featured in those newsletters, which come out to review the month before. So the next one should come out probably before the 8th or 9th of July to review June. So a huge thank you to our speakers. Really appreciate Veronica, Duncan, and Benjamin joining us today. It's really been an amazing discussion, and we hope that the recording itself gets watched and leads to more discussion online at the community practice and beyond that. So thank you everybody for attending, and we'll see you probably in 2 or 3 months at the next one. So thanks everybody.
Thank you. Bye.